Hello and welcome back to the Configure Additional Network Segments lab. You may recall that when we last stopped, we had taken a snapshot of our firewall. Here, I'm going to show you how you would restore it if you wanted to get back to just how the machine was at the end of step 4. There we go. We just restored it. That was it. And then we can start up the machine. As before, we need to let it start up before we open our Ubuntu administration machine. You may have left your machine open, and that'll be okay. It'll work fine. We'll just have to log in again when we start to work with the configuration. We're going to work on network firewall rules. And I want to put out a disclaimer. The rule sets we use here are not those you should use in a real environment. They're just examples that illustrate important firewall concepts. We're going to do a few things, like block SMTP traffic coming out of a regular user network segment, because there shouldn't be any email servers running there. And many organizations embarrass themselves and get their email systems blocked because a rogue email server fires up on their network and starts spamming the world. We're also going to look at some of the configuration we would do for a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, to allow the internet to reach in, but also protect the rest of our network from possible compromises in the DMZ. And then finally, to enable messaging from the DMZ to move into our secure net segment. Okay, the machine is started up. That's great. You may notice that there are now 4 interfaces listed here, and they're the ones you set up in the last lab, and they use the IP addresses set up in the last lab. Remember, if you accidentally click into this machine, you might have to hit your right control key in order to get your mouse back. Okay, since that one started up, we're going to start the next one. This is our Ubuntu admin machine, and it will start powering itself up. I've noticed a few times when I've logged into the system that this Firefox, when I start Firefox up on this machine, it seems to take a couple minutes to reset itself. And that's a little annoying, but it's really not a problem. Just delay. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to click on that to start Firefox up, just like we did in the previous section. And Firefox seems to have started right up for us this time, so that's nice. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and enter an IP address for it to open. You think of it as opening a web page that's hosted by the pfSense router in order to allow administration. The last time we were in, I went ahead and saved the password, but you may recall that the username is admin and the password is pfSense. It's spelled up here. Of course, we would change that in a production machine. Okay, let's get right to the firewall rules. The first rule we're going to put in place is a blocking SMTP rule to apply to the LAN segment. So we go to Firewall Rules, then we click on the LAN tab so that it shows us the existing rules for the LAN segment. Remember that LAN corresponds to the OfficeNet segment in our architecture, and it's designed for where our people work, as opposed to specialized machines that would be publicly facing, like the DMZ, or highly secured systems like a database server or a security log server on our secure net. So we're going to add a rule. This is a block rule. It applies to the LAN interface, IPv4, and the protocol is TCP, and that may surprise you a little bit, but SMTP, the mail protocol, actually runs on TCP. So at the transport layer, this is the protocol. We're going to say if the source is from LANnet and it is SMTP port 25 traffic, then we want to block it. We'll put in a description. You can see I've been practicing because my comment already showed up when I went to enter it. And I click save. And I'm going to apply that change. Another disclaimer. Actually, if you wanted to block SMTP, you probably would have to block a couple of more ports. For instance, you might have to block the SMTPS for secure or encrypted port or some other alternatives. So this is just an example. The rules always get a little more complicated in reality. It's important where this rule falls in the list. It's after what's called the anti-lockout rule, which is created automatically by pfSense. The anti-lockout rule makes sure that the router can receive information, can receive communication and connections from the LAN network so that we can reconfigure it. Without this rule, you might lock yourself out of your own network configuration. That wouldn't be good. It's also important that so all the rules go after the anti-lockout rule. It's also important that this rule is before these other two rules, which are very permissive. They allow essentially any connections in or out of LAN, which often is done for sets of computers that are going to be doing general work because you never know what someone's going to run. That's not necessarily a great idea in light of the least privilege principle, but this is something that is done from time to time. So this rules are executed in order. So first, it makes sure that if someone's trying to talk to the router interface, they can get to it. Then it looks to see if this is a message, a connection being requested from LAN out to somewhere else as a SMTP server. This is like an email server, not an email client. And if it is, it blocks it. Then if it's an IPv4 connection, it lets it happen, or if it's an IPv6 connection, it lets it happen. So that's how those rules would be applied. All right, that takes care of 5A in the instructions. Next, we're going to go on to 5B. 5B relates to the DMZ. So we're going to click on the firewall rules for the DMZ segment. It gives you a little commentary right at the beginning. There's no rules for this interface now, and incoming connections will be automatically blocked. It has a deny all rule that's implicit at the end of its list, which says anybody attempting to make a connection to a device in the DMZ will be rejected. Of course, that's not such a good idea when we want the world to be able to connect to our publicly facing services. So the first thing we're going to do is allow that kind of connection to come in from the internet. We're going to do it in too broad a way. We're going to say that anything can come in and talk to any of the devices in the DMZ. Much more network configuration with NAT translation and NAT rules and so on would be applied. And then specific kinds of mesh connections would probably be allowed for specific servers. Email to the email server, RDP connections to the RDP server, etc. But we're just going to add a generic rule that says anybody who wants to can connect into the DMZ. So the rule set as covered in the instructions, I'm looking at the instructions as I go along, I hope you are too, is the pass rule for the DMZ, and it's going to be IPv4, which is what it uses. Actually, I'll change that and make it IPv4 and IPv6. And I'm going to say any protocol because there could be lots of different protocols to talk to different machines on the network. And I'm going to say then Anything coming from the WAN net, that stands for Wide Area Network. This is the network segment that connects to the internet in our architecture. That's going to anything in the DMZ net, we're going to allow. And put a comment there. Those comments are really important as you try to maintain a rule set in an organization. Okay, so now you can see we have a firewall rule, and actually all the details we put in there show up here. So the next thing we're going to do is add firewall rules to block devices on the DMZ from talking to our devices in secure net or the LAN net, the office net. We do that because presumably the machines out in the DMZ are at risk and they might be compromised. And if they were, they might start initiating messaging to our other devices that we want to keep secure. So we're going to block that possibility. So we're going to add a rule. And this is a blocking rule, not a passing rule. And it applies to the DMZ and IPv4. And it applies to any protocol, not just to TCP. And it says anything coming from the DMZ going to the LAN is to be blocked. Now remember that this only blocks connections going into the LAN network. If somebody in the LAN network reached out to the DMZ, those messages aren't blocked. Those are automatically allowed. Okay, so that blocks going into the LAN network, and we can do copy. And then we can tell it to similarly block things going into the secure net network. And now we have 3 rules. The next rule we're going to make is we're going to allow devices on the DMZ to reach out to the internet, just as we allow devices on the internet to reach in to the DMZ. So this is going to say anything on the DMZ can go to anything on the WAN. I'm going to allow any protocols. Any number of reasons that devices there will need to do that. The last rule we're going to add is a rule to allow people on our office network to access the machines on the DMZ, because we do want that to be possible. We need to access our own email servers and our own FTP servers and our own web servers. So we're going to add that rule. And this will be a pass rule because it's allowing. And this stuff's all okay, although we're going to say any protocol because we're not limiting the kinds of traffic. We're going to say anything from the LAN network can establish a new connection to the DMZ network. This allows our internal users to use our publicly facing systems. Hope I spelled that right. Okay, so now we have a set of rules. As we work on, I'm going to make it a little smaller so we can see it better. One thing we want to pay attention to is the order in which rules happen. Now, in this particular case, none of these rules overlap. So we don't have to worry that somehow a rule will hit this pass rule and then not apply a needed block rule, because these are all for packages from different places to different places. So we're not going to worry about that at this point. But we do need to apply the changes whenever we make changes to our rule sets. We need two more rules to complete our configuration of the DMZ firewall rule set. We need rules that allow devices on the DMZ to talk to specific devices on SecureNet. The two examples I'm using here is that the e-commerce server needs to send its security log messages to our security server, and it needs to send requests for data to our database server. So we're going to add another rule. This rule is designed to allow the e-commerce server talk to the MySQL server living on SecureNet. This is done with a pass rule from DMZ, IPv4, and these requests are passed by TCP, so that's good. And here we're going to choose a single alias or host. And we're going to tell it that 10.0.2.102, which is our e-commerce server, is allowed to open connections to the destination server 10.0.3.103, which is what we have defined as our database server in the SecureNet segment. Now, in fact, MySQL needs more ports than this, and so we would probably need a couple rules, or we might be able to create a group to combine the rules into a single firewall rule. But that's a detail we don't need to cover right now. Say that rule. In addition, we're going to make a rule that allows the security logs to travel. And to do that, we're going to copy this same rule again, and it's still TCP, and it's still from the same host, but this time it's going to a different host. We're going to say that our security log server has the fixed IP address 10.0.3.200. We'll save that. You'll notice that these two rules are above the block rules. And that's really important because basically this rule would block any communication from the DMZ network to SecureNet. So these two exceptions to that rule have to be above it in the list. First, we have to allow these two, and then any other connections would be blocked. So we're going to save and apply them by applying those changes. Okay, we're doing good. Now we're going to move on to step 5C. And this is going to be the inverse, in some ways, of what we just did for DMZ. We're going to look at SecureNet. And what we've done now is that we've allowed the DMZ to send messages to SecureNet, but we haven't let those messages travel onto SecureNet on the other side of the interface. So we're going to add a rule, and we're going to kind of do the opposite of what we did before. So we're going to know that we're going to pass SecureNet IPv4 TCP packages that come from a single network or host, 10.0.2.102, which is the e-commerce server, going to a single host, and that is 10.0.3.103. That's our database server. But in this case, we're only going to allow a certain port, and that certain port is 3306. Said before, I think MySQL would probably use a couple of different ports, not just this one, but we're simplifying for our purposes. same old message we typed in last time. Allow ecom to connect to the database. We're going to save that. We're going to copy it. And this time we know that the log server only uses 601 to send its log messages. And we know that the log server is device 200, IP address 200, 10.3.0.3.200. And that takes care of that rule. Notice I made the rules here a little more specific on the inbound. I could have put these ports into the export rules on the outbound rules for the DMZ as well. Those kind of details can catch you up in a real environment, but they're okay for our lab. The last rule we're going to add is a rule that allows for maintenance. Our IT managers, our IT administrators operate on the OfficeNet segment, and they're going to need to get into SecureNet in order to do their work. They might use all kinds of protocols like ping and ICMP and etc. We're going to say that only this one device, it happens to be the one we're working on right here, right? This Ubuntu machine, 10.0.1.101. We're going to allow this one machine to do anything to open any kind of a connection within the SecureNet network. Of course, we practically could tighten this down, or we could create a sort of a user group so that a number of IP addresses would be allowed and so on. Again, those are nuances we would use to manage our list in a production environment. And we're going to apply those changes. Okay, so there you have it. That's lab step 5, A, B, and C. You really should read the notes. There's a lot to learn and a lot of insights to be gained as to what this all means. But I hope you learned a lot too in the lab.